I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce today's guest presenters, Adam Danielson and Jared Lewison. Adam has spent the last 10 years building extensive experience in the fleet safety and driver safety arena. Throughout his career, Adam has had the privilege to work in both the fleet logistics vertical and the risk and safety service vertical, allowing him to accumulate unique insights around maintaining driver safety and mitigating employer risk. Adam supports a supervision team that focuses on providing a comprehensive suite of driver safety solutions and service tools to assist companies in mitigating risk within their organization and ensuring the safety of their employees. Jared Lewison is the Midwest Sales Manager at Supervision, powered by Explore Information Services, LLC. Jared has spent his entire career focused on fleet safety at the driver level. With a background in driver screening, DOT file management, work compensation insurance, claims management, driver training, and now continuous license monitoring, Jared understands the importance of keeping the road safe for transportation companies and civilians. He sees supervision as a class of its own solution and wholeheartedly believes that this can provide the protection that companies need to drive success. AccuSource partners with Supervision to provide our clients with high-quality continuous license monitoring and fleet safety management. Now I will turn over the presentation to Adam and Jared.
Thank you so much for the great introduction. We greatly appreciate it. I'd like to first thank AccuSource for partnering with us and allowing us to attend such a great event, and those that were able to take the time out of their day to join as attendees. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to hopefully providing some strong insight and some takeaways from today's presentation. So some of you may be wondering who is Supervision, and I like to kind of take a step back a little bit on that and say that Supervision is both a who and kind of a what within our organization. The who of Supervision is the commercial fleet monitoring and safety suite vertical within our corporation, Explore Information Services. We are the piece in the arm that works with employers in managing their commercial fleet driver risk and hopefully mitigation across the United States and into Canada. As I mentioned, Explore is the company that we all work for. We have those three different business units, Supervision being the one vertical. The other big vertical within our organization is our insurance vertical, and for over 30 years, as you can see, we've been providing cost-effective risk avoidance solutions for property and casualty insurers. And many of the customers that we deal with, we work with over 17 of the top 25 insurers, many of which you're very familiar with, Progressives, Geico's, and Nationwides of the world. But the key crux to our entire organization and what the pillar of our success is based on our continuous license monitoring. And as you can see, we monitor over 83 million drivers across North America on a monthly basis. The third arm within our organization, which is duly noted, is our government section, and we provide software solutions for the internal registration and fuel tax tracking. So that's the who of Supervision. The what of Supervision is also our services, and it's our brand. As I mentioned earlier, we provide a comprehensive suite of monitoring, compliance, safety, performance management, and training solutions. And so it's the brand of our solution package. So why we're here today? The risk of overlooking driver safety. Candidly, the drivers are the largest source of fleet liability risk within an organization, and it's truly growing on a daily basis. As I mentioned, on average, fleets report 20% crash rates per year. So as we look at our fleets, or if you're backing into numbers within your own organization, simple math would tell us that If you have 1,000 driver fleet, you can expect 200 crashes each year. That's a pretty astounding number when you really back into that number. And as we stated earlier, accidents, costs, and out-of-service events represent not only the largest, but it's probably the most quickly growing fleet expense category within an organization that has drivers. We know that motor vehicle accident cost employers over $56 billion in 2017. That's an astounding number. The focus on driver safety and building a safety culture can significantly reduce these costs. And before a true safety culture can be effective, both the driver and the fleet manager, or the managers themselves, the ownership, they must understand the level of risk an irresponsible driver can possess or poses in their organization. Entrusting a driver with a company vehicle, and I'm going to emphasize entrusting, because we're going to come back to that specific term later in the presentation, or entrusting them to drive their own vehicle on company time is a big risk. If the driver isn't prepared to adhere to safety regulations, you have to ask yourself, are they a risk that's worth taking? So today we're going to take a look at a few different categories or a few different events throughout the afternoon or early morning, depending on where you're at. But in our agenda today, we're going to go over the various functions. The importance of a motor vehicle record, the impact of license suspensions. We'll get into quite a bit of detail there. The cost. I think I probably hit a hot button to most of the people in the room because we're all cost-conscious people. The cost of accidents to employers, the risk of liability exposure, and a lot of this is hidden, and we're hoping that we can identify some of that for you today. Closing the liability exposure and risk gap. Jared, later in the presentation, will also try to help provide some different ways we can close that gap. And then how do we positively affect driver behavior and retain our greatest asset? So the importance of motor vehicle records, and why are they important? Well, MVRs are probably the most effective way that you as an organization can determine what level of risk or not at the hire of a driver or an employer, or excuse me, of a employee, and also be able to continue to monitor and maintain that determination through their employment. And here are a few different areas that the motor vehicle record and information that the motor vehicle record provides. Driver licensure and information. So that's your basic information of the driver. Obviously, we all have seen it before on their driver's license, things along those lines. The next area would be license status. Pretty simple and self-explanatory in the respect that, do they have a valid driver's license or not? And the MVR will be able to designate that for you. The historical events of a driver, traffic violations and accident reports, very significant pieces of information on the MVR, which will really give you insight of what that driver looks like. What is their history? Have they had a lot of risky behaviors? Do those risky behaviors fit into your culture? And last, but certainly not least, vehicular crimes. And this is a big one. Vehicular crimes are a huge red flag of a risky driver, which would lend to saying, the term crime. But the vehicular crimes will show, prior negligence on behalf of that driver that resulted in a gross misdemeanor or even felony and possibly jail time. Among other items, it could include DUIs and accidents which caused a large amount of property damage or bodily harm. And employers who miss these types of things at the time of hire put themselves at significant risk for future liabilities and losses. The regulated drivers, and I'm not sure how many of the folks that are on this webinar deal with this on a daily basis. But the regulated fleets, obviously, they have specific regulations around how you monitor and how you continue to assess your drivers. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration requires that, and here's the statute if you're looking for it, 391.25, that each motor carrier shall at least once every 12 months review the motor vehicle record for each driver and employees. And it must consider any evidence that the driver has violated any applicable federal or motor carrier safety regulations. So that's the bare minimum. That means they're required to pull an annual MVR on each of the drivers within their organization that are currently employed, which is great. It does put some regulation around monitoring and assessing drivers, but it does still allow for 11 months of exposure of that particular person's driving habits and history. So the impact of license suspensions, and there's various types of suspensions and things that cause that. As we mentioned, safety begins with knowing, and I would ask you all to take a couple minutes here and think about, do you know how many of your drivers have a suspended license? We know that on average, 7% of drivers have a suspended license. So take that number and start backing that into the folks within your organization and the volume of drivers within your organization. And do you know for sure, if they're not self-reported, there's a gap there, and how soon or how relative is it? Are they suspended today? Were they suspended for 6 months? Were they suspended a year ago? So you may ask, what's the problem? Well, the problem is 75% of those drivers will continue to drive and are driving today. And you have some of those folks in your fleet today. So the risk doesn't end with knowing, because many of them will continue to drive after knowing that they're suspended. Another key component is that not all suspensions are driven from a driving related issue. Almost 40% actually are related to non-driving offenses. That could be unpaid child support, outstanding parking tickets, unpaid student loans, which waive the cost of going to college or any secondary education right now. There's quite a few loans out there, so that can extend for quite some time. Here's an interesting statistic. We know that 14 times higher crash rate for suspended drivers versus non-suspended drivers. That's a staggering number when you think about there's 75% of them still driving out there, and they're at that much higher of a crash rate than the rest of your drivers. And lastly, it all boils into 1 in every 5 fatal accidents involve a driver with an invalid license. So we'll talk a little bit here about license suspensions, the different kinds of suspensions, just to kind of give you a flavor of what to expect or what you may want to look for. As we mentioned, there's many unknown risks, but most states kind of will follow some very general types of driving or items that cause driving license suspensions. For example, reckless driving. They're probably all pretty familiar to most of you. Careless driving, leaving the scene of an accident, unpaid accumulated driving tickets or tickets, assault on another motorist, and multiple DUIs. Now, these types of suspensions are very serious and are often accompanied with additional fines, potential legal actions, and large risk to companies employing any type of person in a driving capacity. And it's key, you as managers or you as supervisors, it's key that a driver manager take immediate corrective action in the event that a driver upon report of any type of suspension. So those are driver related. So those are pretty straightforward. I think most of us understand and have probably often seen these types of violations or incidents that cause suspensions. But as we stated earlier, the non-driving license suspensions are a little bit more coy. They don't always show up. They're not always even known in many cases by the driver. But somewhere in depending on the state or the jurisdiction, they can cause suspensions. Failure to pay a fine or appear in court. That's probably the leader of all of the different ways your license gets suspended. Non-driving related drug violations, unpaid child support we stated earlier, and defaulting on student loans. Those are pretty common. There are a few we think are pretty quirky and kind of interesting, but nonetheless can cause suspension in different states. For example, in Indiana, if you're writing bad checks, if anyone still has a checkbook, that's probably even more astonishing. But if you're writing a bad check, you're going to get your driver's license suspended. In multiple states, boating while intoxicated, or I'd even say with the new ATVs and UTVs, anything on a motorized vehicle can cause a suspension. Vandalism in California, you may end up getting your driver's license suspended. This is an interesting one. Advocating to overthrow the government. If you do that in New York, you're going to get your driver's license suspended. And last but not least, operating an amusement park ride while intoxicated. If you're in Texas, don't ever do that. But I think the real big takeaway on this altogether is these are other ways that we don't know about, we often don't hear about. And the scary part is, if you look at this number, more than 7 million people nationwide have had their license suspended for failure to pay a court fine or administrative debt. It happens all the time. So should the manager take action? Absolutely. As you look at this, and you're going to hear more about this, an unlicensed driver that continues to operate puts an organization at risk for negligent entrustment lawsuits. Keep that in your data bank. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Negligent entrustment lawsuits, regardless of reason for the suspension. So employers have the duty to know what is in their driver's history prior to putting that driver behind the wheel. We all know that history often repeats itself. It's no different in the regard to suspensions and or continuous risky behavior. 1 in 3 invalid operators, on average, sustain 3 or more suspensions or revocations in the 3 years prior to a crash. So the indicators are out there, and this is on the MVR, and this can be found in some continuous monitoring types of solutions as well. But the indicators are out there, and commercial drivers with the violation convictions are 43% more likely to be involved in crashes during the year following the conviction. So that lends to the data we just talked about, right? So 75% of them continue to drive. They're risky. There's a good chance they're gonna have a crash after that violation. So I'll ask you, are you sure about your driver's license status? And more importantly, are you sure about your employee's driver's license status? So we knew we'd get here, and I know this usually is a hot button within any employer or company or organization, is there are obviously costs associated with risky behavior. And the stakes are extremely high. As we stated earlier, motor vehicle accidents represent not only a large, in some cases, the largest and growing expense category in most companies employing drivers. You heard this before, and you'll hear it throughout because it's just a staggering stat. You know, the cost of motor vehicle accidents to employers in 2017 was $56 billion. of the vehicle accidents cause 53% of the vehicle accidents cause employees to miss work. So when they're having these accidents, it's relating in lost work hours and or the ability to continue to provide the function within the organization. And thirdly, it costs on average about $760 in auto service costs per day when a vehicle and or person are out of commission. So these are averages. And so I would just ask you to kind of think about what that cost looks like in your organization. It could be quite different. It could be quite a bit more. And as accident severity increases, obviously the cost grows exponentially. And we'll break that down in a few different categories. But if you look at the average cost of a crash with property damage, that's minimal property damage, you're looking at close to $6,000. I would say that's probably a little bit on the low side right now. That number's been creeping up significantly over the years. Average cost of a crash with just one single injury, sprained wrist, anything along those lines, could be upwards towards $64,000 and more. And last, certainly not least, and the most scary of them all is what's the average cost of a crash if there's a fatality? First of all, the cost is priceless in our book, but it can start out at close to $700,000 just to start with the cost of the crash. But that doesn't bring in everything. I mean, we're just talking about different pieces of bent metal and injuries and things like that. The direct costs seem to be pretty straightforward. I'm guessing we can all kind of either experience this or know of it. You know, your direct costs, you're going to see personal injury, vehicle damage, the bent metal piece, pretty tangible, pretty understandable. Workman's comp, many of you are working in that daily, kind of understand the ramifications and the costs of doing that type of business and processing those types of things, towing and storage, etc. What I think is the most hidden are in those indirect costs, right? So are we considering what the cost of service disruptions are, and what does that mean to your business? Lost clients and sales, that's probably a direct relationship to the service disruptions, or it could be a relation to the negative reputation that you're garnering over in your market space. Fortunately or unfortunately, everything gets publicized nowadays and gets reported, and it's all out there for us all to see. So if you have a strong brand on your vehicles and things like that, and they're in an accident and they're on the nightly news, that can have negative impact on your reputation and overall loss of clients and sales. And lastly, claims and legal fees tend to drag on, and there's a lot of undertone and undercurrent that can last for quite some time. So you ask the question, can you afford the risk? You know, you as an employer, we all as employers have an ongoing obligation to track our driver's license status and MVR history. It's the quickest and most easiest insight of all the different events that could create a risky or a driver and or person on the road. So not knowing puts the company at risk for liability and exposure. And why are you so exposed? Well, it's pretty simple. When you start thinking about folks that get into an accident or accident that an employee of yours has caused, the folks that are in that accident, they perceive the employer to have the deep pockets. You're the ones that are going to pay for this accident, incident, legal claims, and also medical claims. And typically businesses, we all want to get this put behind us, and we all want to settle fairly quickly, which has spawned this recent trend of nuclear verdicts. Okay, so verdicts more than $10 million in legality. And we've seen this trend explode into the fact that in the transportation-related liability cases, it's hit an all-time high in 2019 of over $280 million. So it's not going away, and it's not only is it not going away, it's going to continue to grow. Unfortunately, we live in a society that seeks retribution in some of these cases. So regardless of the severity, as we mentioned, the potential harm of publicity, going back to some of these indirect costs, there's a combination of costs that are at risk here to your organization and your brand reputation. So the risk of liability exposure, I asked you all to take a minute and retain the term negligent entrustment, because this is a big piece to this risk piece within your organization. And so I'll kind of give you an oversight on it. Negligent entrustment occurs when a dangerous article, keep dangerous article in mind, is entrusted to somebody who is reckless, inexperienced, or incompetent. So what do those three terms mean? Reckless means risky, inexperienced, risky, or incompetent, very risky, as you're entrusting someone, okay? So the article in our situation is the vehicle, and I would actually say it's the vehicle and the person, but you're entrusting this dangerous article to this person. And if the entrusted individual has an accident, the injured party will bring the legal case against the entrusted individual's employer, oftentimes bypassing any part of the driver themselves, okay? They're going to go to you. Your name is on the door for all of the reasons we just explained previously, the deep pockets, things along those lines. And here's how they're going to do it. This is what they're going to prove, and this is what they're going to align themselves with when they form this case around negligent entrustment. The organization entrusted the vehicle to a driver. Remember that driver who's incompetent, who's inexperienced? The driver was reckless, incompetent, they were unlicensed. And the organization knew, or here's the key piece, or should have known. So if you're not doing the things today that are allowing you to the insight of what this driver's history is or what their risk level is, that driver could be reckless, could be incompetent, and could be unlicensed. You're putting yourself in a position of significant risk. And this can create these nuclear verdicts. So I'm going to leave you, I'm going to shift gears to Jared here in a minute, but I want to walk through a real life experience or situation that occurred, okay? So Patterson versus FTS International Manufacturing. So Joshua Patterson was driving his pickup truck on US Highway 259 near Ore City, Texas, when Bill Acker, a truck driver for FTS International Manufacturing, rear-ended Mr. Patterson's truck at a significant rate of speed, very high rate of speed, actually. And Mr. Acker was driving a semi-truck, tractor-trailer. Upon this accident, or after this accident, Patterson, the pickup driver, sought chiropractic treatment, underwent back surgery, and in the end, eventually was unable to continue to work due to the injuries he sustained. So a couple key things came out of this. The post-collision drug testing of Mr. Acker, the truck driver, showed that he had marijuana and methamphetamines in his system at the time of the accident. Pretty significant piece of information. Again, maybe unknown, probably unknown to the employer. I hope it was unknown to the employer. So, you know, it is a piece of the puzzle. But here's a key piece. Acker had been convicted of 3 moving violations within the 36 months prior to his hire date. And FTS was aware of this. So they must have pulled an MVR, or they were doing continuous monitoring, something along those lines, but they they knew that this driver had these violations. FTS's policy dictated that if a prospective driver had 3 or more moving violations in the 36 months prior to the date and time of hire, the driver was ineligible for employment. So you can see where this is snowballing and escalating, and the issues are mounting. So when you take a look at everything that was known or unknown, going back to negligent entrustment, FTS entrusted Mr. Acker with that vehicle, knowing the risk that they were putting on their organization and on the rest of the folks on the highway. Even their policy was to prevent this and didn't prevent it. This employee should have either not been hired at all or should not have been allowed to drive a vehicle for the business in any capacity. So where this goes and it boils up and it bubbles up, and the scary part about this is, and the lucky part is, that nobody passed away from this accident, but FTS International, negligent entrustment cost them over $101 million. That's a nuclear verdict. And that's actually, they actually came out of that fairly lucky, considering there was not a fatality involved. So just wanted to paint a picture for the group today, kind of show you what some of these risks are. I'm going to turn this over at this time to Jared Lewison, and at this time, he'll kind of walk us through how we can close that exposure of the risk gap.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it. All right, this is where everybody can just stand up and do a quick jumping jack. Here, I'll do one with you. All right, we're ready to go here. So how can a company protect itself, you ask? Well, the answer is simple. It's through continuous driver license monitoring. You see, today as it sits, most companies have a common practice to check an MBR at hire, and then some companies are required to do one once per year throughout employment. Some companies are not. It depends on your fleet org structure. But regardless, even if you are doing what's somewhat effective with that MBR pull, that leaves 364 days of risk exposure for that driver to have activity in between now and the next time you pull that MBR. And what companies don't realize is they have an important duty of care to ensure that they only put safe drivers on the road. And by failing to do so, much like Adam just discussed a moment ago, they can be faced with large, costly lawsuits that can be a result of an accident. And for many companies in the country, those types of lawsuits are enough to close the business permanently. So what does continuous MVR monitoring provide? It allows the fleet manager or driver managers, dispatchers, depending on your org structure, to be made aware and take immediate action on these events as they occur. So whether it's a moving or non-moving violation or a license status downgrade, that driver manager can be notified and apply the proper corrective action for that company policy to that driver, whether it's remedial driver training, a dismissal for a serious offense, or if it's something as simple as an expired license, just getting that situation taken care of and getting that person back to compliant and on the road safely. So the way that we just talked about and what's the most common practice is typically a company will pull an at-hire MVR, then there'll be no activity that they know about during the next couple of months, and then they'll pull that annual MVR. And while that's good, and it's better than doing nothing, and it is meeting the basic minimum requirements for most companies, that leaves opportunities for violations to occur, and then all of this time until that next annual happens in April of the following year for that violation to just sit out there. So you think about a driver that gets a DUI or a drug offense and now doesn't have a valid license, or regardless of the reason, doesn't have a valid license. Now you don't know about that, and they could get themselves into an accident, and then the risk and exposure of the liability applied to the company is going to be tenfold. So the answer is, with the continuous monitoring approach, it's a lot harder for things to fall through the cracks. So you go in for a position, you fill out the paperwork, they pull a pre-hire MBR on you, and they decide to go ahead and move forward with hiring. Now, if a company has continuous monitoring in play, they'll be getting monthly alerts at the very least. Some states report daily, weekly, or monthly, depending on the state of the driver, but we enter them into license monitoring. Now, a driver manager understands that there's been a violation or a license status change, gets an actual real-time email alert or text alert from a continuous monitoring company, and then that allows them to be aware and take action and get that driver back on the road safely. And then once that action is taken, we continue monitoring again. And so we can understand if there's been any activity in the interim. Example of this situation and why continuous monitoring is significantly more important than just pulling the annual bare minimum MVR is, let's further use this example. So Robert, great employee, he's been driving with a clean record for 5 years for this company. Robert attends a happy hour on a Friday night, and upon leaving, he gets a DUI. Now his license is suspended. What's Robert thinking, you ask? Probably the same thing that anybody on this call would be thinking during that scenario. Probably thinking, well, my annual MVR was pulled here last month, so they don't know about it, and it was clean at that time. Much like the rest of us, you would consider what would be the fallout if you reported that to your superior. Would you lose your job? You know, we all have a family to feed and food to put on the table and bills to pay, so it's very difficult to consider losing your job, so he's probably scared to report it. And then lastly, he's probably thinking, if I fight this DUI and I can win my case and get it off my record before the next annual MVR pull, they'll never know, and all is well. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because now you have Robert driving a company vehicle on company time with a suspended license, and as Adam mentioned before, any activity is a trickle-up effect. So they're not going to go after Robert. If something happens, they're going to go after the company. And how does an employee handle this situation? Well, we touched on it through continuous driver's license monitoring. Did you know that 20% of drivers are responsible for 80% of the risk? 80% of your fleet or the drivers within your fleet already practice road safety and adhere to company policies. So this is what we refer to as the 80-20 rule. Monitoring benefits, you can protect your stakeholders, you can protect your business and your reputation with the stakeholders. Not only that, but monitoring can help you have better track history on accidents and help you maintain and retain new business. But we can reduce MVR expenses. So if you're only pulling one annual MVR pull to review for your entire fleet, which is the bare minimum, and many companies do 2 or 3 or even quarterly MVR reviews, but if you were only doing one, an average MVR costs $10.14. So if we go back to Adam's example of that 1,000 driver example, you multiply that out by your fleet, and just one MVR review will cost you a hard dollar cost on MVRs alone of $10,140. Whereas if you're monitoring, and we consider the fact that only 20% of your fleet are going to exhibit risky behavior, that means that your annual MVR expense for when you're monitoring is just $2,028. So about an $8,000 savings in simply just the hard dollar costs around MVRs. And with that, with the reduction in MVR expense and frequency, naturally comes the reduction in administrative burden and cost and time. So if you think about it, an MVR, if it's easy to read, and they're not all easy to read, and I'm sure some of you experience that, but it would take 5 minutes on average to review that motor vehicle record. 1,000 driver fleet example, you're looking at 83 hours of loaded labor to review those MVRs. And again, that's just for one pull. So you're looking at over 2 weeks of resources and costs to review that MVR pull. Continuously monitoring your driver's license, and again, thinking about that 80-20 rule, your MVR labor time is going to be dropped down to 17 hours, and that's through the whole year. So that 83 hours is just for one review. So any beyond that, you have to add to that number. If you do 2 reviews, you're at 160 hours. I mean, it's astronomical. So a significant time and cost savings from a labor standpoint when monitoring. And with all of that comes a reduction in risk and damages of liability of related accidents. So I'm not going to go through these bullets again, but as Adam mentioned, the cost of accidents is significant. It can start out as low as $6,000 and be up to and over $1 million, depending on the severity. But the point is with this, for what it would, for the equivalent of 4 years of license monitoring would cost less than an accident with just one injury. So for 4 years, what you would pay for just this one accident here, you can eat up 4 years of license monitoring costs and get in front and help prevent those incidents from happening. And for 40 years, that's how long you could pay for license monitoring in order to prevent one fatality. But as Adam mentioned before, there's no cost that you can put on a fatality. So by providing these alerts, we can help prevent some of these accidents from happening. And as it relates to the fatality, the alert can prevent those because 1 out of every 5 fatalities is linked to an unlicensed driver. Monitoring benefits don't just go for unregulated fleets. They can create significant benefit for your regulated fleets. So those of you that are guided by the DOT and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, you're required to obtain 7 basic metrics of CSA. And those metrics are hours of service, vehicle maintenance, driver fitness, crash indicator, hazmat compliance, controlled substances, and unsafe driving. And for those of you that are measured by the FMCSA and these DOT regs, you know that it's extremely important to keep those scores down because, for one, the FMCSA, if those scores get too out of whack, can shut you down and close your doors of your business. But it can also affect your ability to procure new business as well. And from my past experiences working in the insurance arm, in the background, especially work comp related, underwriters review these scores as well, and that can impact your insurance rates. And in what's already a volatile insurance market, it can even make it so you can't secure insurance. Now, the 2 basics that can be positively affected by continuous monitoring are crash indicator and driver fitness. Crash indicator is reducing the number of accidents, and driver fitness is reducing the number of invalid CDLs. So the driver fitness score, on average, our monitoring customers experience a 70% decrease in just their first 6 months of license monitoring. Over the first 2 years, a company can see a driver fitness score decrease by up to 31%, which again is significant. That crash indicator score can also be lowered by up to 30% over the first 2 years. We did a case study with one of our current clients, Transport America. Transport America has about 1,300 drivers, and for those of you that are responsible solely for driver management and compliance, you can understand that with that kind of a driver count, even if you have 4 or 5 people putting resources in, it's still a lot to digest. Now, Transport America was doing what was required by the DOT and FMCSA. They were pulling annual MVRs, and even beyond that, they were even pulling them more frequently than that. But they were still seeing CDL suspensions and violations fall through. And just by implementing a license monitoring solution, they were able to reduce that driver fitness basic by 49 points over just 1 year. And this is important because, as mentioned earlier, it can help you secure insurance. It can help with something called out of service events and lost time. So Adam mentioned earlier that $760 a day is the cost for an out of service event. So as it pertains to driver fitness specifically, if we can get in front of some of those license suspensions before those employees go out on the road and get pulled over in a roadside inspection or a weigh scale, we can certainly provide some help there and reduce those numbers and save some costs as well. So positively affecting driver behavior. This is a staggering stat. I've read through this 100 times and I still can't get over it, but 94% of accidents are preventable. So that's what we're trying to do, is get in front of these accidents. Proactive road safety. Driver behavior plays a role in 88% of fatal crashes. So it's important to provide driver training because that can change driver behavior. And it starts with the culture of the company. So if the company's providing driver training, you can impact driver behaviors. And that assesses driver behavior. It pinpoints their poor habits and provides them coaching to correct and improve their skills. Likewise, driver training program benefits reduce accidents and associated costs, which can be astronomical. It can reduce the opportunity to be caught into a negligent entrustment liability suit. It can reduce your insurance costs, improve fleet uptime and productivity, but most importantly, it can save lives. Not all training programs are created equal. It's important to have a baseline exam because core competency scores can pinpoint driver strengths and weaknesses. And each driver, although they should complete a standard curriculum, we all have different individual deficiencies, so it's important to be able to identify those. Custom learning plans. It's important to have targeted critical weaknesses first. So we want to ensure that individual drivers' most dangerous behaviors are addressed as soon as possible. So that's where those critical learning or custom learning plans come in. And then you want to employ a progressive strategy that digs deeper into the root of the crash cause, keeps the driver engaged in learning, and promotes continuous improvement. Now, things to look for when you're evaluating training. So dedicated training works great. Everybody knows what the Smith system is, and there's hard facts around how that works. But we all also have been through those long trainings, and we understand that it's hard to keep the attention of participants during a long day training and seminar. So instead, it's nice to reinforce safe driving awareness by continuously releasing short, single topic focused lessons and have the driver complete them at least once a month. It keeps the message in front of it keeps the safe driving practices at the forefront of the driver's mind, which is why that's so important. It's important to use local information too, because laws and regulations differ between cities, states, and countries. And then it's important to provide a variety of learning resources. We all learn a little bit differently, so if you can have a platform that's multifaceted, it's extremely helpful. So visual learning techniques through pictures and videos, verbal through written and spoken words, physical interactions, which is just having involvement, having to actually physically identify these issues, and then using logical systems and reasoning. Here's an example of the accident rate between a 30-day training and a 90-day plus. Going back to the example Adam used with 1,000 drivers, you look at 15% over 20% from the 30-day to the 90-day training. And in that scenario, that's an additional 60 accidents to your fleet. So it can be a significant cost to the company. An accident crash course cost. So if you have 200 accidents a year and you're having 70% property damage cost accidents, 30% that are tied to personal injury, and then 0.5%, which is a fatality, that's a total cost of accidents of $5.28 million. And so with the driver training program, you can reduce your costs in just 1 year of your accident costs and frequency by 30%. So you're looking at $3.93 million, which is an annual savings of $1.35 million. We had a case study that we did with a natural gas provider. They were experiencing incredibly high accident rates. They had 3,060 accidents between 2013 and 2016 for a total of $24.1 million in accident costs, which is astronomical. So what they did was they piloted a program, and the non-pilot drivers had a 51% increase in accidents per preventable incidents per million miles, which totaled in a 5-year anticipated cost for accidents of $44.5 million. The piloted drivers saw almost an 18% decrease in preventable incidents per million miles, which led to a reduction in anticipated costs of $28.7 million. So quick math on that, it's almost 16 million in savings over 5 years. I think that anyone would get a promotion if they could come up with that much extra money. It's important to protect your fleet. MVRs are a cost-effective way to identify risky drivers, but they're not the end-all be-all, and they don't provide constant enough information. So the cost of not knowing, as Adam mentioned before, is $56 billion a year. Potential nuclear liability risks that could be exposed and closed down your company. But continuous monitoring can mitigate risk, lessen expenses and administrative burdens around MVRs, and reduce your safety scores for your FMCSA regulated drivers. And driver training obviously can assess driver behaviors, pinpoint poor habits, apply corrective accident plans, and significantly reduce accidents and accident costs. Now, Supervision is the only continuous driver license monitoring solution on the planet that can offer license monitoring in all 50 states, Canada, and American provinces. We offer many products that are all based around reducing risk and improving safety, and provide analytics to improve performance. We are a license monitoring provider, but we're not just a license monitoring provider. We can provide SIDless reports, hazmat help with a hazmat app to properly placard loads. We have document storage. We have CSA tools and driver retention tools. And we have a driver training platform, which allows for driver behavior improvement. So with that, I'd like to again say thank you to AccuSource for being a great partner and allowing us to present today. And I'd like to open that up for questions.
Thank you, Adam and Jared. Now we will dedicate the remainder of the webinar to addressing attendee questions. If you have not had a chance to ask a question via our chat box, please feel free to do so now.
Thanks, Heidi. The first question that we had is, what risk does the employer have if they drive their own car?
Yep. So that's no problem. So as you think about the risk applies the exact same, whether somebody is driving their own car, whether they're driving a company car, or if they're on a fuel reimbursement. So if you provide a fuel reimbursement, if you would provide a car allowance, or you provide a company vehicle, the risk is all the same, and it's all applied to the company. So by driving their own vehicle, and you likely providing a gas reimbursement or something like that, you're still considered the liable party.
Thank you. The next question that we had is, how many alerts come from driver's license suspensions?
Sure. So we talked about that earlier, and roughly 7%. Oh, I apologize. My mistake. 20% come from those.
All right. The next question is we are often blindsided by tickets and suspensions that arise from a personal nature, like unpaid child support, personal parking tickets, or non-moving violations. Does continuous license monitoring detect those?
In most situations, yes. The continuous license monitoring solution is based off adjudicated incidents. So for example, if somebody just recently got a ticket for speeding, if it has not gone through the court system and been adjudicated and printed to the motor vehicle record itself, you may not know that immediately, or it may not hit as an incident the day after you get a ticket. But once that becomes an adjudicated arrest or incident or violation, it should pick it up. Some states are the challenge with any solution like this is the states often report differently. So we get it in different capacities, or some states may not report on the specific incident of child support, but the majority will on any type of incident that causes a suspension.
Great, thanks for answering that. We're almost at the end of our time, so this will be the final live question. Again, attendees, if you entered a question into the chat box and we didn't have the opportunity to address it live, our team will follow up with you directly post-webinar to provide an answer. So the last question is can you explain what the enrollment process is?
Yeah, no problem. So, in a typical fashion, and we've done the presentation here, but we provide a demo and give some information. And once a customer decides to move forward, we execute agreements. Once that's done, we simply work with them. They get a dedicated account rep, and that rep will work with them to get some identifiers and some information to set up their own unique site. We create users, divisions, all of the background stuff to get a company started and get the site set up the way they want. We provide secure links so that their driver information can be sent to us safely and securely so that they don't have to worry about PII or any of that. And then it's simply loading their drivers. Our account service reps provide them individualized training and support, and then pretty much from there it's up and running. You know, once a company decides to commit to a partnership, usually it's a matter of a few days after the legal process is gone through.
Thank you, Adam and Jared, for facilitating this informative webinar, and special thanks to our attendees for joining us today.